Darei la parola a Gerard Kreijen, dei nostri colleghi di Loyens Luf, Amsterdam.
Thank you, Marco. I'd like to address two issues with you. The first one is a new regulation, quite fresh actually, from the EU, concerning restrictive measures against cyber attacks threatening the EU and or member states. Now, this particular regulation is actually directly connected to an incident which happened in the Netherlands last year. 4 occupants of a car were arrested, turned out to be Russian citizens working for Russian military intelligence, and the car was parked outside the building of the OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. In the boot of the car, cyber interception equipment was discovered, and the gentlemen were obviously interested in what was going on online, actually in the building and within the premises of the OPCW. This triggered the final steps in the current regulation I'm going to address with you, but the history is longer, of course. We have the Estonia cyber attacks of 2007, and the current regulation is also part of the cyber diplomacy toolbox which the EU is developing. So this regulation is interesting in several respects. It's a thematic regulation, so it doesn't focus on particular countries, on a third country, but applies autonomously and globally. It's simply focused on cyber attacks. There are only 2 other examples of such thematic regulations, which is the Regulation Combating Terrorism of 2001, and the other one is the Regulation Against the Use and Proliferation of Chemical Weapons of 2018. Secondly, and more importantly, this regulation uses extremely broad concepts, extremely broad wording, but at the same time, and this may be an indication of the broad concepts, provides interpretative guidance, which is rarely used by the EU in its regulations. And it's a clear indication of how broad the concepts that are being used really are. So this regulation applies to cyber attacks with a significant effect, which constitute an external threat to the EU or its member states. And as far as the sanctions are concerned, you should be thinking of the typical sanctions as asset freezes, the prohibition to provide funds or economic resources, and travel bans imposed on those responsible for cyber attacks, who provide financial, technical, or material support for such attacks, or who are involved in other ways. There's no guidance on the other ways in the regulation. So these cyber attacks, in order to lead to sanctions, must represent an external threat, meaning they must originate from outside the EU, must be using infrastructure outside the EU, or persons instrumental to the attacks must be established abroad. So internal cyber attacks coming from the territory of the EU or attempts thereto do not trigger the sanction regime provided for by this regulation. The apparent presumption being that the member states will deal with that on a national level through national law. The regulation does also provide guidance on what is considered a threat. Article 1.4 is quite illuminating in that respect, and it states, cyber attacks constituting a threat to member states include those affecting information systems relating to, inter alia, critical infrastructure, including submarine cables and objects launched in outer space, services necessary for the maintenance or essential social and or economic activities, in particular in the sectors of energy, electricity, oil and gas, transport, air, rail, water and road, banking, financial market infrastructures, healthcare, etc. And critical state functions, in particular in the areas of defense, governance, and the functioning of institutions, including for public elections and the voting process. One is reminded here of the accusations of Russian interference in the 2016 presidential elections in the US, where more than 50,000 emails from the Democratic Party were leaked into the public domain. So the attempted attacks, or the actual attacks, must also have a significant effect as far as the scale and scope of disruption are concerned. And to give you an idea of what a significant effect is, we have Article 2 of the regulation. The factors determining whether a cyber attack has a significant effect, as referred to earlier, include, among others, the following: the scope, scale, impact or severity of disruption caused, including to economic and social activities, the number of natural persons or legal persons, entities or bodies affected, the number of member states concerned, and I was reminded here of the power outage we had in South America, I think 2 weeks ago, where the power in Uruguay and Argentina went down simultaneously. The amount of economic loss caused, such as through large-scale thefts of funds, economic resources, or intellectual property, etc. So I think at this stage it's quite difficult to predict what the use and effect of the regulation will be. Given its broad scope, it is likely that individuals will be listed at some point in time, but its effectiveness remains to be seen, given the general difficulties, of course, in tracing back malicious cyber activity and in pinpointing the individuals that are responsible in that respect, although we already have 4 Russian candidates for the list. The second issue I would like to turn to is a particular Dutch one. It concerns the export of information and communication technology from the Netherlands, and this also has implications for those outside the Netherlands, because the Netherlands, as you know, is a very important export hub. This concerns in particular a certain category of dual-use goods, 5A002, and we have encountered it, for instance, with respect to so-called routers for computer systems using encryption. So if a company which is distributing these routers or exporting these routers from the Netherlands would apply for a global license, that's the preferred license, because it is generally valid for 3 years. It is valid with respect to a certain type of goods, applies to 1 or more customers in a certain country, and it actually puts you into business for a number of years with respect to a series of transactions. This had always been the practice that such licenses would be granted, but to our surprise, we were informed by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that the client could not obtain the global license unless it would incorporate in its internal compliance program a so-called human rights paragraph, which implied that it had to check every jurisdiction where it was sending these routers to, whether the routers could be used to abuse human rights. So actually government policy was transferred to the private sector, tasking actually the client with government policy and government control. You can have a debate on that, but that was the requirement. If not, if such a paragraph would not be included in the internal compliance program, the company would have to apply for individual licenses, only allowing 1 transaction at a time for a limited period, so also only for the transaction, and also requiring much more documentation requirements. You have to provide a contract, you have to provide a certified end-user statement, and you would have to do it for any and each transaction, which could ruin your business. So we found the Dutch government to be quite adamant in this respect, whereas normally they are always open to a good argument why requirements should not be interpreted too strictly, which is, as far as the Netherlands is concerned, we generally advise clients to update their internal compliance programs with the human rights paragraph. And in that case, once it is incorporated, normally you will have no further problems obtaining the global license. Thank you for your attention.